Welcome to the Unhurried Living Podcast. My name is Alan Fadling, and I invite you to listen to leadership conversations that will help you to develop healthy rhythms of rest and work, and to live fuller in friendship with God. I hope this podcast will help you to overcome hurry and make time for what matters most. And now, enjoy today's episode. Hey friends, welcome to episode 230 of the podcast. My name's Alan, and I'm so glad you joined me here. I'm hopeful that our time together will help you rediscover an unhurried way of life and leadership. Each week on the podcast, we have leadership conversations to help us lead better in the spirit of Jesus' unhurried way, the way of leadership that flows from a full soul instead of an empty one. Sometimes I'm talking with fellow authors, and sometimes I'm talking with leaders just like you who are learning to live and lead at the fruitful pace of grace and peace. Today, I'm sharing a recent conversation with Andrew Arndt about his book, Streams in the Wasteland. In it, he shares the ancient wisdom of the desert fathers and mothers who journeyed to the wilderness to seek a closer journey with Christ. Andrew shares some of the parallels between their experience with Rome then and our experience today. I was first introduced to the Desert Fathers and Mothers in the late 80s when I read Henri Nouwen's The Way of the Heart. The subtitle of that book is Desert Spirituality and Contemporary Ministry. It was his sharing of the wisdom of the Desert Fathers and Mothers, especially about solitude, silence, and prayer, that launched me on a very different spiritual trajectory than the frantically busy one I'd been on up till then. Our guest, Andrew Arndt, is the lead pastor of New Life East. It's one of 7 congregations of New Life Church in Colorado Springs. There, he also hosts the Essential Church podcast, a weekly conversation designed to strengthen the thinking of church and ministry leaders. Andrew has written for Missio Alliance, Patheos, The Other Journal, and Mere Orthodoxy. He lives in the Springs with his wife, Mandi, and their 4 kids. Now, if you're a new listener, welcome to the podcast. If you find these episodes helpful, would you please follow, rate, and review, and would you also share this podcast with your friends? For now, let's dive into my conversation with Andrew Arndt. On today's Unhurried Living podcast, I'm pleased to have Andrew Arndt, author of Streams in the Wasteland. Thanks, Andrew, for joining me for this conversation.
So delighted to be with you, Alan.
I've been looking forward to it. I so appreciate the book that you've written. And in fact, I love starting a conversation like this by asking the author, if you would tell us a little bit about the story of how this particular book came to be.
Yeah. So the story with this book, it was not a book that 5 years ago I would have ever imagined writing. Although I was very aware of the Desert Fathers and Mothers. I've told a lot of people, anybody that knows my story knows that I was born and raised non-denominational, charismatic, Pentecostal. That's my background. So let's just call it our reading list was very narrow when I was a kid. We were reading a lot of stuff by Kenneth, Copeland and Hagen and Oral Roberts and people like that.
Gotcha.
But one day I was in the kitchen and my mom had a big, thick book on the island. And that book was The Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster. And I was probably 17 years old. And I was in the midst of an awakening of the Spirit in my own life personally. And so I was just devouring anything I could get my hands on. I saw this book and I went, Mom, what is that? And she said, well, our pastor recommended it to me and I've been reading it and I really like it. And I said, well, can I read it when you're done? She said, sure. So she pushed it my way when she was finished. And man, it was like, that was the gateway drug for me. Here was this Quaker who was writing about the life and the Spirit, talking about spiritual disciplines and leveraging all these voices from the past, including a few Desert Fathers, if my memory serves me right. So that was like kind of the thing, 17, 18, then in this little kind of sequestered, theological tribe. And all of a sudden woke up and went, there's this whole wide world of Christianity out there. And became really fascinated with ancient Christianity, I think, back in, even in those early days. By the time I, was in my early 30s, I had co-planted a church in Denver with some friends. And so I was a young pastor trying to find my bearings.
Yeah.
And I found myself veering very quickly to the writings of Henri Nouwen and, In the Name of Jesus and Creative Ministry and books like that. And then The Way of the Heart wound up in my lap. And I loved The Way of the Heart, simplicity or silent solitude and prayer.
Yeah.
That he just wrote it with that classic Nouwen winsomeness that's so, appealing. And so I first was really introduced to them there. And they I would say the Desert Fathers and Mothers kind of floated on the edges of my life until 2017. And it was really a personal crisis that threw me deeply kind of into the deep end of the pool with them. And we had planted that church with some friends in, 2008, 2009. And I just remember being a 28-year-old moving to Denver, Colorado with a wife and my 3 little kids, thinking I'd been an associate pastor at a church in the Midwest for a little bit and thought, this is my thing. Like, this is the thing that I'm going to make my mark with, And that's a young man's anxiety for sure. But yes. I remember hearing Rick Warren say, that like most pastors who plant churches, they leave them too early. They don't give themselves the chance to stay over the long haul and really see ministry in 3 dimensions. And I was like, yes. So I'm going to stay forever.
Yeah.
I always used to tell that church, 30 years, I'm going to be here. And, I'll die preaching and they'll bury me in the backyard as an old man. And I had my idea of the future, was so clear. And then in 2016, my wife and I just started feeling some stirrings of the Spirit that maybe our time to be done was going to be sooner than we thought it was going to be. And sure enough, that was all confirmed in so many different ways. And by 2017, I had turned the leadership of that church over and we had packed up the moving truck and we moved down from Denver to Colorado Springs, where I took a new job at New Life Church, sprawling, evangelical, charismatic mega church. And I've told a number of people this, Alan, but on paper, in some ways that reads like a graduation. Like, hey kid, you did a good job planning this nice little urban church, a few hundred people in Denver. But now the mega church is knocking on your door and they're asking you to come and be a teaching pastor there, of all things.
Oh my God.
This is amazing. Here's your moment. It was not that for me. For me, it was like being put in a witness protection program. So I had my identity so wrapped up in, I am the pastor of Bloom Church in Denver, Colorado, neo-monastic, charismatic, liturgical network of house churches, blah, 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 all that stuff. And that goes away. And I was coaching pastors and leaders from around the country and all the stuff we were learning. And all of a sudden it felt like in a day that vaporized. And my first few months out here in the Springs, man, were being put in a witness protection program. Here's your new job. Here are your new friends. Here's your new city. Here's your new everything. Here's your credit card. Have a nice life. And so the stripping away of identity was so disorienting to me. And a few months into that process, I was just grasping for anything. And a former congregant friend of mine said, man, you really need to read the Desert Fathers and Mothers. And I said, why? And they said, because the experience that has been thrust upon you, that's really difficult for you, they sought. They were looking for it. And they actually came to discover that experience, the experience of everything being stripped away, identity, power, reputation, status, influence. They saw that as the surest possible path to God. I think you'd really benefit from them. And so I started reading them right there in the fall of 2017. I bought Benedict Ward's alphabetical collection of the sayings of the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and I read them daily. I would wake up in the morning and have my normal devotional time, read the scriptures and pray. And then the first thing that I would read is 5, 6, 7, 8 sayings. And they just, I say this in the book, the best way to say it is they became cartographers of the holy for me. Here I was in this space of darkness, not knowing where I was or what I was supposed to be doing. And they charted the uncharted terrain for me. And they helped me see that all the things that were happening to me, this desolation that I experienced, was a place where God could be found. So I immersed myself in their stuff. They helped me actually fall in love with the wilderness to the point when new kinds of opportunities came knocking, to step up in new capacities of leadership. I didn't really want to, actually, because I'd fallen in love with this, I'd fallen in love with my cell, is how they would talk about it. The Fathers and Mothers. This is my little place, and I've found God here, and I don't need anything more than God. But okay, if you insist that I take these steps, then that's fine. So they changed my life, man. And what I found myself doing pretty quickly, after a year or so, really letting them kind of get into the water supply of my life, is I found that it changed my pastoral ministry.
Yes.
And pretty soon I'd be sitting with people who were in crisis, and I'd find the wisdom of the desert was all of a sudden on my lips. And I go, there was a guy about 1600 years ago in Egypt that said, da, 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 da. And that actually sounds really similar to what you're going through. What do you think about that? And they go, yeah, that's it. So it reshaped my life, it reshaped my way of pastoring people. And it also gave me a new lens for seeing what's going on in our society. And we are in a time of exceptional madness. And in fact, the original title of the book was A Beautiful Madness.
Oh, wow.
Reconnecting with the radical sanity of the desert fathers and mothers, because I was trying to hit kind of that angle of like the craziness of what's going on in our culture. But I wanted to write this book as a way of just helping introduce people to some friends that have been helpful to me. Yeah. And then also maybe name some stuff that's going on in our culture and just say like, hey, can we have a conversation about that for a second? That's not really the way of the kingdom. And let me show you why and how. So yeah, that's where it came from.
Thank you. I love hearing that story, and I can see, the parallels. I could see, how your wilderness, the vocational wilderness, was not at all unlike the wilderness in which the desert fathers and mothers went, escaping a crazy Rome.
Yeah.
Maybe could you just say a little bit more, because some of our folks won't really be familiar with what exactly these desert fathers and mothers were about. Who were they, and what were their circumstances?
Yeah. So, we know the early story of Christianity. Jesus of Nazareth, God in flesh, comes and leads the movement, and he's crucified and raised to life again, and leaves behind the promise of his spirit and the promise that he'll come again. And the early church is this beautiful organic movement of people that are living by the Sermon on the Mount, full of the Spirit, with no pretension to try to take over the world. They're just trying to bear witness to the new creation until Jesus comes again. And as the next few centuries ensue, Christianity, though it goes through some time of persecution, we get to Constantine, and all of a sudden there is this marriage in the 4th century between Roman power and the Christian religion. It becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And it was right around that time that there were a group of men and women in the church who really started feeling like that Christianity was losing its soul, that something about the radicality of the gospel, something about the extreme situation of being a minority group that was persecuted, somehow that going away had taken the edge off. And now, I think it was Stanley Hauerwas, the Duke ethicist, that said this a long time ago, where once it took a lot of courage to be a Christian, all of a sudden now it takes a lot of courage to be a pagan, because it's just too comfortable. And comfort does something weird to the church. And so these people who were really concerned about the church, concerned about their own souls, the Roman Empire all of a sudden is going through its own kind of things. We've got the barbarian hordes at the edges of the empire, are starting to advance. There's instability in society. And so these people, in response to that, withdrew to the deserts of Egypt, Syria, and Palestine to rediscover the radical way of Jesus and to reconnect with the love of God, really to seek a radical kind of purification of who they are as a way of bearing witness to the truth. And David Bentley Hart remarked in one of his books that really what happened with them is that they re-evangelized Christianity. So like a renewal movement broke out from these people because they were extracting sort of the pure essence of Christianity and then giving it back. And before too long, you got people from across the Roman Empire traveling sometimes hundreds of miles to come and sit at the feet of these desert fathers and mothers to learn the way of the kingdom from them. And then they're going back into their world with this, like, I saw something that, like, I reconnected with the way of Jesus through these people. So, and that's the impact that they had on me, you know, that they had gone off into the wilderness. Their sayings and stories are preserved. I sat at their feet and I went, wait, there's something going on here. And it's not like, to me, it's not like something subsequent to Jesus. To me, what these guys are like, and I think that the Lord does this. I think that all throughout church history, what you see is God raising up people here and there that by virtue of their strangeness, their sheer otherness, they actually throw you back into the wisdom that you should have known, but you forgot. So they throw you back into Jesus. So we'll get like a Rich Mullins, you know, in the 90s, the 80s and the 90s, who by virtue of his radicality makes us remember the purity of Jesus. Or Mother Teresa, or Dietrich Bonhoeffer, or Francis of Assisi, whoever. These guys, to me, are like almost the first wave of that in the first few centuries of the church.
That's really helpful. They sort of move out to the edge they follow Jesus. I think some of them even use the language of following Jesus into the wilderness, because Jesus begins his ministry wandering out to the wilderness, right? Being led by the Spirit. You mentioned, and I'd love for you to unpack a little more, how very parallel the experience of the Desert Fathers as it related to Rome, how very parallel their experience is to our experience living in the cultural environment in which we find ourselves now. How the Desert Fathers might especially be speaking to us right now. Yeah.
I mean, I think, the Pax Romana was the idea that Roman rule had brought peace to the entire world. And that peace came at a cost, crucifixion. You'd go into Roman cities and you'd see the bodies of the crucified hanging there. This is what happens when you step out of line. So while it's saying peace everywhere, there's this bloody understory. And then, of course, there were subjugated peoples paying taxes to Rome. And so there was a second story kind of going on. There was like the official, Roman propaganda was kind of a big deal. And so these people were kind of going, well, that's not the way of the kingdom. And I think that's true of the church living in a secular society in any age, that we go, wait, there's something going on here that's just not right. It was the Roman satirical poet Juvenal that talked about, I think this was in the 2nd century after Jesus. I mean, his big thing when he looked at Roman society, he was like, the people are just amused by bread and circuses. Like there's moral degradation is setting in. Nobody's really actually vigilant about righteousness in society or being good citizens. Just bread and circuses, like it's food and it's entertainment, and we're going to fall if we don't fix this. And I think about the moment that we live in. We live in a big country with a history that has some things in it that are really beautiful and good, and then some other things about it that are not. And it has some exports that it gives to the world that are great, and some other things that are not so great. Yeah. And we're living in a time of great social turmoil and political upheaval, and we're grasping to try to find our bearings in the midst of this. And it's a tough season to live. I think about what Henri Nouwen said. I think he said it in Way of the Heart, actually, years ago, when he said that our society is not a society that's radiant with the love of Christ. 40 years ago, whatever. Yeah. So if the definition of a spiritual wasteland is we're not radiant with the love of Christ, surely that's our moment that we're living in now. And it's not about who's, the left or the right. It's really about a mood, a tone where we're kind of losing our humanity because we're so afraid of some group out there that's going to take away the things that we value. And now all of a sudden we're drawing lines in the sand and we're creating enemies where the gospel has actually made friends. We're losing our minds. So that's a long, meandering and roundabout way of saying, I think that there are really profound parallels between what was going on in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century and our own moment. And I think, again, what the Desert Fathers and Mothers were trying to do is they were trying to help people reclaim their humanity. Yeah. And I think that really is what this book is trying to do also. It's trying to help people go, hey, there's a way that we're living right now that is really it's not right. We can reclaim our humanity. This is how. Well, I really resonate with what you're sharing. And there's no question these last few years have deeply tested whether or not our roots were deep or not. Yes. And some of us discovered they weren't nearly as deep as we thought they were. That's right. And again, maybe share a little about how particularly the Desert Fathers and Mothers and their wisdom really speaks to that issue of stepping into depth in the midst of a situation like the one in which we find ourselves. Well, I'll give you, I could give you 100 examples of the way that they give us wisdom for this, but I think one of the profoundest things that they give us is the reminder that judgment belongs to God, and therefore we can and should live in a posture of non-judgment towards others. Now, that doesn't mean that we're turning a blind eye towards sin or things that deface our humanity, because they also value discernment. Yes. They're trying really hard to help us understand like what's going on in this interaction or that interaction, and how has that actually created a space where sin creeps in and it's dissolving our humanity. But what they insist on doing is they insist on us holding a posture of non-judgment. And by non-judgment, what they basically mean is that there's really no circumstance under which we decide to label people as the out group and throw them away. And the reason for that is precisely our story. The story that defines us is the story of how God of very God, the second person of the Trinity, became an outcast on our behalf in order to find out all the outcasts and bring us home. Our God has solidarity with the outcasts. And that love, which was a non-judgmental love, actually has the impact of judging the sin inside of us and leading us back home to the Father. So then go church and do likewise. Live in a posture of non-judgment, And so and to me, that's just one example, but I do think, I've said this to a number of friends recently. I think that one of the great moral challenges of the moment that we live in, we're talking about society here as a whole, but I think this filters all the way down to our relationships with our family and our friends, is can we hold space, for instance, can we hold space with somebody that has a different belief system than us, a different political view than us? Can we hold space with a genuine other and neither feel the need to annihilate them, right? Either physically or with our judgments and our penchant for exclusion, or feel the need to run away from them and bail out of the space? Mm-hmm. Can we actually hold that tensive space in a way that allows the wisdom of the Spirit to emerge? And the only way that we can do that is by holding a posture of non-judgment. So, again, we're living in this moment where everybody wants to label everybody else, and we've prejudged everybody. Well, because you voted for this person, you also believe these things, and I can't hold space with, okay, stop. Yeah. We're becoming dumber in the process of that. Like, we're foregoing the opportunity, number one, to learn what's motivating people and driving people and get better in our critical thinking. Oh, okay, so this is the value and this is how you're fleshing that out. That's fascinating because I hold the same value, but I flesh it out in a different way. Yeah. So we could learn and grow, but we're also foregoing the opportunity to walk in love, which is,
I think that's sort of one of the important things.
Yes, according to the scriptures. I mean, the end of all things is that we are redeemed completely by love, and we live in a communion of love with the triune God. And so every step we take towards that is a step towards our salvation, our ultimate sanctification, so we're missing those opportunities. So, non-judgment, I think that's a big one. And I mean it. To me, it's like the spiritual discipline of being able to hold space with another. Yeah. That might be the most significant moral achievement that anybody can rise to in our moment in history. I
think, that is something that the Desert Fathers demonstrate in so many really remarkable ways. And it is one of the ways in which they show themselves imitators of Jesus.
They do. And their solidarity, as we're talking about this, a funny story comes to mind about two of them that were living together, and they were struggling to live together in a peaceable way. And they're just always at odds with each other. And one day, one of them said to the other, okay, here's what we're going to do. The next time we have an argument, you take my side and I'll take your side, and we'll see how that goes. The story goes that they spent the rest of their days in peace. So
it's hilarious.
They're in their, I say this in the book, but like in their unremitting oddity, they're so strange. You just read story after story after story like that. But these examples have a moral seriousness to them. Yeah. Because what that story is inviting us into is like, can you take the risk to see something from somebody else's point of view? And if you'll do that, it's very possible that takes all the tension out of the room so that you can experience the peace of God that is already real in Christ Jesus,
Oh, that's so beautiful. Well, I know for me, in reading the lives and the sayings of the Desert Fathers and Mothers, sometimes what I've drawn help from is some of the practices that were important to them. Mm-hmm. I wonder what perhaps have been some of the practices that you've taken on that you first sort of saw them fleshed out in their lives.
Well, I think it was Arsenius. Arsenius was one of the original Desert Fathers, and he had been like a Roman diplomat, aristocrat. He was higher up in society. He was one of these ones that was just beset with like this, something is not right in my life. And he heard the Lord say to him, Arsenius, flee, be silent, and pray always. And these are the sources of sinlessness. And, Henri Nouwen framed his book around those things, solitude, yes, silence, and prayer. Flee, be silent, pray always. I think the first, maybe the most important thing that I gathered up from them really just was the importance of prayer. And I always believed that. I think it goes with the territory. If you're a believer, that prayer is really important. I saw it modeled in a lot of people in my childhood, but I think they pushed it even more profoundly on me, that prayer is this place where all of the great angers and frustrations of our life fall away. Prayer is also the place where the great desires of our life, that sometimes they're godly desires, but they're misapplied in the wrong way. Like we can err not just by desiring the wrong things, but desiring the right things in the wrong way or in the wrong time. Yeah. And they insist, this is Nouwen's phrase, but they insist that prayer is a furnace of transformation, where the things that shouldn't be in our lives are burned away, and the things that should be in our lives, they're purified and they're refined so that we can move forward into the will of God in a right way. And I think encountering them helped me remember that, helped me remember how crucial it is that, to quote another Desert Father, sit in your cell and your cell will teach you everything. Like reclaim the spaces where you're just quiet before the Lord and you become moldable again so that God can reach you, teach you, and speak to you. So I think probably the most important thing that they gave me was just like helping me reclaim that space in my own life, the quiet space with the Lord. So that's huge. I think the other thing that they gave me, and I think it's directly related to all of this, and we could talk about, about 1,000 things that they gave, but I think the other thing that they gave me that was so profound was, it's the vow of poverty. It's what happens when we become non-possessive with our things. And I think that's directly related to the life of prayer. Okay. So because when we're in prayer, what happens is we come to realize that God is our all. Thomas Merton said it so beautifully, when he said, why should I desire anything that cannot give me God? And why should I fear anything that cannot take God away from me? So that what that allows you to do is you're in life like this. And so many of the great conflicts that we have in our lives are because there's something that we really desire or something that we're clinging to so tightly. And that's part of the reason that we make enemies with people. So again, when I think about the life of our society, the moment that we're living in here, I mean, you've got the right and the left shouting loudly at each other. And both of them what are they afraid of? Yeah. They're afraid that the other side is going to win and that they're going to wind up having to live in a version of America that they don't love and agree with. Well, here's what the Desert Fathers and Mothers say. Stop fighting over that thing, and you might actually be able to be a transformative presence in your own space and then with those people that right now you're tempted to see as your enemies. If I can lay down my need to have the perfect America or America that's just perfectly suited to my kids, that might actually free me up enough in my spirit to be a healer, a reconciler, and also to be a prophet where I need to be a prophet, to say what I need to say because I'm not afraid of losing, because I've already lost everything for Jesus. So those couple things, there was a later father that the Eastern tradition, St. Isaac the Syrian, you might be familiar with. One of the things that he said that our ancient fathers, he said that as long as somebody desires something too greatly, the enemy has a vantage point against him. And so he says, so our fathers, think about this. Oh, I love this. He says, so our fathers clad themselves in non-possessiveness as with a weapon.
Yeah.
So part of the work of the desert is going like, God, what am I clinging to too tightly? Maybe it's my identity. Maybe it's money that I have. Maybe it's position. Maybe it's power. Maybe it's a vision of America. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's a vision of that, how I'm supposed to be, what I'm supposed to do with my life, something I'm clinging to. It's to the extent that I cling to that thing, the enemy has a vantage point against me. But if I can go, I'm letting all things go for the love of God, all of a sudden I reclaim my ability to actually enter into spiritual warfare, to be a transformative presence with other people. So I don't know. I think between prayer and non-possessiveness, those to me are probably the two most important things that they've pushed my way.
So Henri Nouwen, you mentioned his way of sort of capturing that solitude, silence, and prayer.
Yeah.
This is the Unhurried Living podcast. And one of the things we talk about is how our busyness, the ways we identify ourselves, that I am what I do, right?
Yeah.
Nouwen's famous trilogy, I am what I have, I am what people say about me, how that clutters my life, how it accelerates my life, how it winds up my life until I have no space left to hear the voice of the one who calls me his beloved.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, the Desert Fathers made space, radical space.
Yeah.
And then invited others into that space.
They did. And it became a discipleship strategy. When people saw just how profoundly free they were, it inspired people to go and do likewise. Like there's a great story about Abba Agathon, who had a group of little disciples with him. And he had spent a long time building a new little hermitage for himself, so a new little cell, and was very meticulous with it, setting it up just so, and da-da-da-da-da. And then he gets to the end of the process. And he sees, the story goes that he sees something in the cell that displeased him, like one little tiny flaw. And so he goes, okay, I don't want that thing anymore. And he decides, like, we're going to move on to another thing. I'm going to build another cell over here. And his disciples are like freaked out by this. Agathon, people are going to like, how can you do that? Like, if people see this, they're going to think that you're a crazy person. And he goes, that might be so. But it might also be that we inspire people, that they see us and they see me and they go, look at Abba Agathon, how free he is. He has like not a care in the world. I want to be just like that. And so they inspire us in that way, to that kind of radical freedom. Again, that like non-possessiveness that I think in the final analysis, I actually think it allows us just to be healthier in our lives. I mean, think about the missteps, those parents that are listening to this podcast, or they were children and maybe this happened to them. Think about the missteps that we make as parents, or our parents make with us, because they were clinging too tightly to us. Because they needed us to fulfill some role in them. Well, if they had embraced their own spiritual poverty, blessed are the poor in spirit, kingdom belongs to them, and let us go, it might have actually spared us a lot of heartache in our lives. Or I think about pastors that are leading churches, and they should be sharing more of the responsibility. They should be sharing more of the power, but they can't do it because they're afraid that if they do this, it'll slip away from them. And then what will I have? And so it actually thwarts the growth of the church. So if we can embrace that essential solitude, that essential poverty of spirit, it actually, I think, liberates not only us to be happier in our lives, but it liberates our lives to rise into what God intends.
I really appreciate that. In fact, I'm glad you raised this. One of the great fruits of the Desert Fathers was leading people to true freedom.
Yeah.
And of course, freedom is a big theme in an American culture. Yeah. Talk about the contrast maybe between some popular visions of what freedom is and maybe the deep freedom that the Desert Fathers invite us to. Well,
I think here's the clearest contrast that I can make is, I think if you had to just come up with a rough and ready, this is what, let's call them secular Americans of the 21st century believe, and this is what the gospel says. I think secular Americans of the 21st century, we've been conditioned to believe that freedom is it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's my unfettered capacity to chase the good life as I define it, so long as it does not infringe upon another person's rights. And that's how we think about it. I think that there's some things about that are right, but I think that it's so low. It's, you know what I mean? Like, it's such a lowest common denominator kind of definition, so as to be practically unhelpful, because the truth is that we have a nature. Like, there's such a thing as a human nature. I think the universe has a grain. It's set up to run a certain way. And so us just going, well, I get to invent reality and do things however I want to do them. Well, at some point, I mean, like, here's the absolute clearest example of this. Are you free to drink all you want? Well, of course you are. Of course you're free to drink all you want. But if you tip head over heels into alcoholism, is the alcoholic really free? So by the minimal definition, sure, he can do whatever he wants. But by a maximal definition of freedom, he's actually more enslaved than he was otherwise.
Yeah.
So maturity, real maturity, is a growth in the kind of freedom that actually makes us truly free. And I told this story recently in a sermon that I gave on self-control at another church. But one of my kids, Gabe, when he was 6 or 7 years old, I was tucking him in at night, and he's got this look in his eyes like he's got something to say. And I go, Gabe, what's going on, buddy? And he goes, Dad, I just can't wait to be an adult. And I said, why, Gabe? And he goes, because when you're grown up, you can do whatever you want to do. So my first response,
well, buddy,
right. So my first response, Alan, was, is that what you think this is? But so he's wrong about that. Adulthood maturity is not being able to do whatever you want. However, there is an important sense in the Christian tradition where maturity is being able to do whatever you want. But there's a condition attached to that. So Augustine says in a great place in De Trinitate, his treatise on the Trinity, he says, blessed is the one who has everything that he wants and wants nothing amiss.
Yes.
And so what the Christian tradition and the Desert Fathers and Mothers specifically are trying to lead us into is that liberty of spirit whereby our will has become so in alignment with the will of God that, as Dallas Willard says, God could trust us to do whatever we wanted to do because we would only want to do the right things. And what are the things that God wants us to do? And this is a theme that comes up over and over in John's literature in the New Testament. Is the one who loves me will do what I command. But then what's the command? The command is that we walk in love. Yeah. So true freedom is being completely aligned with the love of God. It's loving the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then it's loving in self-sacrificial love for other people around us. And again, one of the reasons that our society is a huge mess is because we've mistaken what true freedom really is. Freedom for us is really just the freedom to do whatever we want, and I don't care about anybody else. But gospel freedom looks like the bleeding Jesus on the cross, giving his life for the life of the world, and thereby we are saved. So if we can start walking in that, I think that we start seeing healing in our families and our communities and society. It's about submitting ourselves to the love of God and finding not only that we are free, but we've also freed a whole lot of other people in the process.
Yeah, there's such a difference between spending freedom and then, going broke versus investing freedom and finding you have more.
That's right.
Being able to say no, the no's that you want to be able to say.
That's right.
Being able to say the yeses that you want to be able to say and be able to have the strength to do so, to have the self-control, do that. That's right. That's a remarkable freedom.
That's right.
And part of what you were sharing too is another thing I think that the Desert Fathers really help us with is we have often a very individually defined experience of God and definition of what it means to be a Christian.
Yeah.
But the communal reality of these men and women, can you talk a little bit about that reality?
I think it would surprise people if they really started reading the Desert Fathers and Mothers, how communal they are, because the impression that we have of them is that they're a bunch of misanthropes who just kind of hated society and hated people.
Sitting up on a pillar, sitting in a cave, complaining, moaning.
And the truth is that the early ones, they did actually kind of flee society and they would live pretty much set apart. But what they started realizing was that God has designed us to be together. And so what they came to realize was that there's this delicate balance of what Dietrich Bonhoeffer called the day alone, the day apart, and then the day with others. Yes. And these guys really exemplify that. They certainly spend a lot of time in their cells, sit in your cell and your cell will teach you everything. But they spend a great deal of time with others. That's why we have these sayings. It's because people went to see the Abbas and the Ammas. And they're sitting at their feet and they're gathering up their wisdom. There were these like little schools of monks that developed. So they remind us that the salvation of our humanity is always a corporate salvation. I think that's something that evangelicals particularly need to remember. I think that we have such an individualized view of salvation. Salvation for us is, if I was the only person in the world, Jesus Christ would have bled and died for me. Well, that's absolutely true. But that's also it's positing a hypothetical.
Not true enough,
It's not true enough. It's positing a hypothetical that's completely contrary to fact. The fact is that when God makes us from the very beginning, he makes us in his image and his likeness, the triune God, three gods, the one God in three persons. And we're made male and female in an ongoing expression of plurality. And so we are created in community. We're created out of community. We're created in community, and we're saved in community, which is exactly what Paul says. Paul says that we're all baptized by the Spirit into one body.
Yeah.
Whether we're Jew or Gentile, male or female, slave or free, we're made one body in Christ. So they remind us of that there's no salvation to be had that's not a corporate salvation. None of us is just kind of making a decision for Jesus and then going off and being in the sweet by and by with him all by. But what does Revelation say? Behold, I looked, and there's a great multitude, nobody could count, from every nation, language, tribe, tongue, people, race, all gathered before the throne of God and before the Lamb. So they remind us of that. One of them said that our life and our death, it was about Anthony, I think Anthony the Great, said that our life and our death is with our neighbor. Our life and our death is with our neighbor. And if we win our brother, we gain our brother, we've gained God. But if we scandalize our brother or our sister, we have lost God. And we need to remember that the most important thing that God gives us is each other. And his presence is located inside of how we interact with each other. Rowan Williams, his great book on the Desert Fathers, is called Where God Happens. And his whole kind of presupposition of the book is that what happens between us is where God happens. And what the desert folk are trying to teach us is how to partner with the ongoing presence of God between us.
That's so helpful. Well, I've sure enjoyed hearing you sort of unpack what you've written about. I wonder, as we close, would you be willing to just to share a word of encouragement with our listeners, kind of in the spirit of the book that you've written?
Yeah, I think as a pastor, the thing that I am most concerned about right now is that the emotional energy of our country is turned up to a 10.
Oh, man.
It's so very high, and the volume is turned up to a 10. And I'm watching the church left and right just getting drawn into all of the noise and all of the madness. And I don't think that we're supposed to just kind of plug our ears and go, la, 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 la. None of this is happening. I'm just going to have my little family over here.
Sure.
Rod Dreher wrote a book some years ago called The Benedict Option, in which he kind of, in some ways, was sort of saying, like, we need to withdraw from society. I don't know if that's the answer. I want us to be inside of this in a way that's transformative. Jesus says, that we're in the world, but not of the world, right? So how do you do that? I think if we're going to do that, we have to be really, really, really intentional about how we live our lives and how we spend our time. And I think that these desert folk can help us. And I think that they help us by, they teach us to reclaim prayer as the central space of our lives, in which God speaks and in which we're molded into the image of God. I think that they teach us the discipline of discernment, non-judgment, with suspending judgment so that we can see what's really going on. And I also think that they teach us how to be in community again. And we need to recapture this. The church, I think, is the training ground for being the new humanity. It's the foretaste of the new humanity that God's making. So they call us back into community where we can practice the disciplines of being in tense space with each other, the disciplines of truth telling, of forgiveness, of reconciliation. And I think if we can do those things, if we can live in the presence of God and the presence of others in our community of faith, well, I think that we stand a reasonably good chance of modeling for the world something that the world is not seeing anywhere else. But we've got to find a way to detach for a second from the emotional volume of this and from the actual volume of it, so that we can come back into it. Like Walter Brueggemann said about preachers years ago. He said that if a preacher is going to bring a word from somewhere else, he's got to live somewhere else to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And that means that you got to protect your 8 or 10 hours a week so that you're coming from the new heavens and the new earth really into the congregation with the word. But I think that's true of all of God's people, that if we're going to bring a word to the world from somewhere else, we got to live somewhere else. We got to find spaces where we've got one foot firmly in the new creation. And then we're coming back into this world of death and disorder and decay. And we're saying, behold, God is making all things new, and you're invited to step into it. So I think that's what I'd say by way of encouragement.
That's wonderful. Well, again, today our guest has been Andrew Arndt, and we've been talking about his book, Streams in the Wasteland. Andrew, it's really been a pleasure to have this conversation.
Pleasure's mine. Thanks for having me, Alan.
Thanks. I really do hope that you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. I mentioned in a recent Unhurried Living Wednesday email that I've designed for myself a spiritual classics study project to revisit several works of classic Christian spirituality. 3 of those books are either written by the Desert Fathers or are a collection of their writings. I have been finding their ancient voice quite fresh and timely. And so I really do hope you'll get yourself a copy of Streams in the Wasteland to benefit from this wisdom as well. Now, in the next few episodes, we'll be talking with authors Matt Tebbe, Ben Sternke, James K.A. Smith, and Tom Nelson. And next week, I'll be sharing one of my daily practices that really helps me deepen my sense that I do all of my work in the presence of and with the help of God. I can't wait to share those episodes with you. Now, if you'd like to receive more help from Unhurried Living, I invite you to join our Unhurried daily email list. For 40 days, we'll send you a brief daily email that offers personal reflections from life and Scripture to help you take the next step in following Jesus' unhurried way. You can sign up on our website at unhurriedliving.com. We're honored to encourage thousands of leaders just like you. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. Join me next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.